Imagine this. You just finished 5 gruesome rounds of interviews, which include product sense, execution, strategy, and systems design, and now you're finally at the behavioral round. You think, this can't be too bad. I just have to talk about myself for an hour. And that assumption can cost you the offer. In this video, I skip all the common advice and show you how to actually ace behavioral questions in a product manager interview. I'll break down what these questions are, how to craft strong answers, and deliver them clearly using the simplest yet most effective framework. Then I'll walk through real examples from successful candidates who interviewed at companies like Google, Amazon, and OpenAI, including one example with prior product experience and one without. I'll end off the video with some practical tips. Let's get started. Most behavioral interviews will ask you 2 types of questions. Number 1, behavioral questions, and number 2, situational questions. This video will cover behavioral questions, but in my next video, I'll go into depth on how to answer situational questions. Behavioral questions will ask you how you've handled real scenarios in the past to assess whether you have the traits needed to succeed as a PM at the company you're interviewing for. Behavioral questions typically fall into 2 buckets. The first type are questions that ask how you handled a negative experience, like failure. Examples include, tell me about a time you made a mistake. Describe a time when your project failed. Tell me about a time you handled a difficult stakeholder. The second type of behavioral questions are questions that ask how you drove success. Examples include, what is a project you are the most proud of? Tell me about a time you solved a complex problem. Tell me about a time you brought a product to market. The key thing to notice here is that although there are so many different types of behavioral questions interviewers can ask you, you only need to keep 4 to 5 different anecdotes at hand to answer them all. This works because once you know the traits interviewers are asking for, you can then shape your story to answer the question and show the interviewer that you are a strong fit for the role. For example, let's say you're asked, tell me about a project you are most proud of. You might answer with your experience accelerating a product launch to hit a major conference deadline, which ultimately drove stronger inbound adoption and interest for your product. That same story could also answer, tell me about a time you made short-term sacrifices for long-term gains, by focusing on what you deprioritized on the roadmap and why those decisions led to a better long-term outcome. Now, regardless of which behavioral question you get, there are 3 things you need to do to craft a strong response. First, we want to list the traits interviewers care about in product managers. Then, with those traits in mind, we want to pull previous experiences that demonstrate these traits. And finally, we want to deliver the story using the Carl framework. First, let's start by listing the traits interviewers care about in PMs. At a high level, interviewers want to see whether candidates embody the core traits of strong product managers across the industry. This includes leadership and initiative, teamwork and collaboration, execution and decision-making, customer obsession, analytical thinking, ownership, and communication. To take this the next step further, you also want to identify the traits that matter most at the specific company you are interviewing for. For example, if I were applying for a product manager role at Duolingo, I would review their job listing or careers page and note the qualities they look for in a PM. In Duolingo's case, these traits include outcome-first thinking, experimentation mindset, user empathy, design instinct, ownership mindset, velocity and self-awareness, and clarity. Once you have your list of traits, you want to then open a blank document and start brainstorming past experiences that embody these traits. As you do this, keep these few tips in mind to help you brainstorm stronger experiences. First, you want to cast a wide net for experiences. Don't limit yourself to just work-related roles. Experiences from school to side projects, volunteering, or personal initiatives can definitely exemplify traits of a strong product manager. Don't worry if you don't have any prior PM experience, as these are still very valuable in the behavioral round. Next, you want to choose stories with real depth. Strong stories have layers. They involve trade-offs, consequences, tension, emotions, all these characteristics that make a good story. Avoid simple stories like we had a deadline, everyone did their part, and we shipped on time. Additionally, you want to own the narrative. Focus on stories where you made the decisions and influence outcomes and less about what the team did. Interviewers are evaluating your impact, not your team's. And lastly, for questions that ask you to recount a negative experience, you want to be honest without self-sabotaging. Look, everyone makes mistakes. You want to show self-awareness and growth, but avoid stories that make you sound careless or ignore basic responsibilities. For example, you probably don't want to share a story where you overslept, missed a keynote presentation, lost a major customer, and then framed it as a lesson that taught you the importance of being on time. A good rule of thumb is to prepare 3 stories about negative experiences and 2 about driving success, since behavioral questions about negative experiences are more popular. When brainstorming experiences, you will quickly see that one strong experience often highlights multiple traits. This means you don't have to worry about remembering so many anecdotes to ace behavioral questions. For example, your experience launching a feature can demonstrate leadership through how you aligned through cross-functional teams and navigated difficult stakeholders. That same story can show customer obsession by focusing on going beyond to conduct extensive interviews with each customer. It can also highlight analytical thinking by using data to validate decisions and measure impact. Notice that the experience itself doesn't change, only the framing does. A small tip here is that although it's good to do your own research about what the company values in their product managers, you don't want it to sound too forced in your answers. Think of it like a date. You might do a little bit of research beforehand, but you don't want to invent interest just to impress the person you're going out with. Instead, it'd be better to look for a genuine overlap and let it come through organically. It does get a little bit creepy. With these experiences in mind, we're finally ready to craft a response using the CARL framework. CARL stands for Context, Action, Results, and Learning. Let me briefly explain each step of the framework and then apply it to a very popular behavioral question. First, we want to set the context and describe the situation necessary for the interviewer to understand the rest of your experience. Then we want to walk through the actions you personally took, focusing on decisions, ownership, and trade-offs. Next, we want to highlight the results to show the impact of those actions, ideally backed by concrete outcomes and success metrics. And lastly, you want to close with the learning, explaining what you took away from the experience and how it changed the way you approach similar situations going forward. This is similar to the STAR framework, but the CARL framework puts more emphasis on what you learned from the experience. Strong candidates will reflect on both successes and failures to show how those experiences taught them lessons which shaped better decisions going forward. With the framework set, let's walk through a sample question commonly asked at companies like Google, Amazon, and OpenAI. Tell me about a time you made a mistake. Let's also assume that I'm applying to Duolingo as a product manager, so the traits I want to demonstrate are the same ones we discussed earlier. Let's look at 2 different answers to the same question, one with product experience and one without. We'll start off with an answer from a candidate with previous product experience. Early in my career as a PM, I was investigating issues in a core user workflow. After conducting customer interviews, many users independently asked for the same feature and described it as a fix for their frustrations. I took that convergence as validation and prioritized building exactly what users described and asked for. The trade-off I made was trusting stated solutions over observed behavior. I optimized for speed and alignment with what users were telling me, instead of stepping back to validate whether the solution actually addressed the underlying problem. When we shipped the feature, adoption was weak. Fewer than 15% of users tried it, and among those who did, retention after the first week was under 5%. When we dug into the data and session replays, it became clear that the feature wasn't the blocker. Users were getting stuck earlier in the workflow, long before the feature would have helped. We rolled the feature back and worked closely with design to map the end-to-end workflow. Using drop-off data and session replays, we identified the key friction points and redesigned the flow through small, targeted experiments. Those changes improved completion rates by 22% without adding a new feature at all. That mistake fundamentally changed the way I run user research. I still listen closely to what users say, but I treat it as insight into the problem space, not instructions for the actual solution. Now I pair interviews with behavioral data and experiments before committing to build, which has helped me avoid shipping features that sound right but don't actually help users. You'll notice here that the answer highlights the traits Duolingo looks for in PMs, which includes user empathy, outcome-first thinking, design instinct, and velocity with self-awareness. Now let's look at the same question, but answered by a candidate without product experience. I was running a volunteer-led community tutoring program, and I was in charge of planning an expansion to a second location for the upcoming quarter. I made the mistake of extrapolating a few strong weeks of attendance and some qualitative feedback into a full expansion decision. I signed a short-term lease and scheduled volunteers before validating whether demand would actually sustain a second location. After launch, attendance was inconsistent. Some sessions were full, while others had very few learners, which often meant volunteers showed up with no one to tutor and resources were wasted. I owned the mistake and paused expansion. Instead of asking, how do we grow faster, I reframed this problem to, how do we expand responsibly? To support future expansions in the next quarter, I designed a 2-week pop-up pilot with clear success criteria to validate demand before committing resources. The following semester, we piloted the program in 4 new locations before committing to expansion. After expanding to only the top-performing pilot locations, we saw participation that was 2.5 times higher than expected, and over 90% of volunteers opted into additional sessions. This confirmed the pilot model and allowed us to scale with confidence without repeating earlier inefficiencies. That mistake changed how I approach growth decisions. I learned that committing too early creates unnecessary risk, even when intuition may feel strong. I now prioritize proving demand in small, reversible ways before making bets that are hard to undo. For this answer, you'll notice that this highlights different product management traits that Duolingo is looking for, which includes experimentation mindset, ownership mindset, and outcome-first thinking. Great, now that we walked through sample solutions, I want to walk you through a few practical tips to make your answers stand out even more. First, you want to tell a tight story. Keep it concise, build tension up quickly, and only include details that move the story forward. Second, use clear structure. Make the decisions you faced, the trade-offs you considered, and the impact of your actions obvious, so interviewers can easily follow along with your response. Next, you want to show, don't tell. Avoid saying things like, I show leadership and ownership. Instead, demonstrate those traits through the actions you took and the outcomes you drove. Next, on the delivery side, you want to sound conversational. You're not talking to a friend, so to speak, but your delivery should have some kind of excitement and enthusiasm, as if you were gossiping with a friend. And finally, practice enough to sound confident, so you know your stories well enough to adapt them on the fly, no matter what question you're asked. Record yourself or practice with friends, since this can help you catch filler words and unnecessary rambling, which you can use as feedback to improve delivery. And that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful in showing you how to answer the behavioral question for product management interviews. In my next video, I'll cover the second half of behavioral interviews, which includes situational questions. Be sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.